Test. Okay? Everybody can hear me? Thank you for coming to our Evenings of History. As Don mentioned last week, this has been going on now for 40 consecutive years without a miss. And I'm pleased to be here tonight to announce tonight's speaker. But as I look out at the audience, I know I see a lot of people who are part of our historical society. And I think you're very smart because it's a great bargain. For those people who are members of the Ouray County Historical Society, you're able to get into events like this free of charge. But more than that, you get into the museum as often as you want, free of charge, and you get 10% off on all the books in our bookstore. We've got a lot of great books about Ouray and the surrounding areas. So if you're not a member this season, become a member next season, because again, there's a lot of perks associated with that. Another thing that Don's mentioned on previous Evenings of History is some upcoming tours. I'd like to just single out the Jeep tour that's coming on Red Mountain on September 1st. It's a Friday. It's an all-day tour. Switzerland of America is going to provide the Jeep, so all you do is show up and bring some food and some beverage, and Don is going to act as your chief guide as he takes you up and down Red Mountain, showing you all the different mines, talking about the different buildings and sites, and as you know, he's a wealth of information, so it's a great event. All you have to do is call the museum to sign up. Again, that's on September 1st, and it goes from about 9 in the morning until 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon. Another series of events that we've had, there were 4 of them, and we're now almost into the 4th one, and if you miss them, maybe again you'll do it next year. But Jenny Hart, who's sitting here in the audience, who is a native of Ouray, knows the city well, has conducted tours around town in which she has pointed out historic buildings and historic homes and talked about their history. This coming Thursday happens to be her 4th and last. And I think her talk is going to take you down to the north end of town, around the Hot Springs Park area, the Lynn Park, the old brickyard, and all the things that were going on down in the north end of town. And that will be this Thursday. Do they have to sign up in advance for that, Jenny? Call the museum? Okay, but they do meet here for those who do sign up around 5:30, and then we'll go till about 7:30 or 8. So if you're interested in that, again, just call the museum. Tonight, I'd like to introduce Ashley Bembenek. She serves as a technical coordinator for the Uncompahgre Watershed Partnership. While working alongside an incredible team, she identifies, prioritizes, and addresses water quality issues in the Uncompahgre watershed. Ashley graduated with honors from Montana State University with a degree in environmental science that focused on soil and water. She has 17 years of professional experience, has worked in Western Colorado for the past 13 years to help organizations understand water quality, prioritize projects to improve water quality and watershed health, as well as support policy initiatives. Ashley loves to ski, mountain bike, climb, and spend time on the water. Tonight, while her focus will be on while the booms and busts of mining are largely behind us, Ouray has been left with a broad range of impacts attributed to past mining activities. This talk will explore the challenges and successes of improving water quality and watershed health at local historic mine sites. So please welcome Ashley Bembenek.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm really excited to be here on behalf of the Uncompahgre Watershed Partnership. I'd like to note there are a number of dedicated board members, volunteers, and project partners in our audience this evening, so this work would not be possible without their support. As already explained, my name is Ashley Bembenek, and I serve as the technical coordinator for the Uncompahgre Watershed Partnership, or UWP. UWP was initially formed in 2007 and became a nonprofit in 2013. UWP exists to help protect the economic, natural, and scenic values of the upper Uncompahgre watershed. And just before I go any further, I'd like to offer a disclaimer. My last public speaking engagement was 3 years, 2 kids, and 1 pandemic ago. So I hope you'll bear with me as we move through this evening's presentation. Okay, so what is mine remediation? To put it simply, mine remediation is the set of practices used to return mining features to a more natural state. Typically, the goal is to isolate hazardous waste from the environment where the waste could contaminate soil, water, and/or air. Effective remediation considers site-specific factors to develop the best plan to mitigate impacts attributed to the site. If you remember nothing else from this evening, I'd like you to remember that the goal of mine remediation is to make the foreground of this photo look more like the background of this photo. Mine remediation is necessary to mitigate the impacts of mining on soil, water, air, and ecosystem services, along with public health impacts in areas where mining occurs. Modern mining requires permits that obligate mine operators to meet specific standards to protect natural resources and public health before, during, and after mining operations. Historic mining operations that occurred prior to such legal requirements, historic mining operations occurred prior to those requirements, and in those cases, third parties may implement the remediation projects to reduce the environmental and public health impacts attributed to those historic mining activities. The remainder of my talk this evening focuses largely on remediation of historic mine sites. My goal is to introduce you to the environmental, legal, and engineering challenges that must be overcome to restore water quality in watersheds affected by historic mining operations. Please note that each of these topics are areas where dedicated professionals, including lawyers and engineers, carefully hone their expertise over a lifetime. I just have a microphone and a bachelor's degree. In several streams and rivers in Ouray County, metal concentrations exceed the levels used to protect aquatic life. These metals include cadmium, copper, lead, manganese, silver, and zinc. A portion of the metals are mobilized through natural processes like weathering and erosion, but a substantial portion of the metals originate from historic and modern mining operations. Because of widespread mining activities and complex geology, mine remediation must be especially strategic in the Uncompahgre Watershed upstream of Ouray. Environmental conditions are just the first of several layers that UWP and other remediation professionals must consider. In the United States, there are 3 primary environmental protection laws that establish reasonable protections of public health and the environment, while also allowing for responsible resource extraction. These laws were initially passed in the 70s and 80s and include the Clean Water Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Despite their meaningful benefits, these laws can sometimes stymie third-party remediation work. And additionally, factors like mixed land ownership, logistics, the steep and narrow 4x4 roads Ouray is famous for, and a lack of funding can create additional challenges that slow the pace of historic mine remediation. Oh, I forgot to advance the slide. There's everything that I just said. And now that I've briefly outlined the challenges associated with mine remediation at historic abandoned mine sites, I'd like to introduce a key concept in watershed restoration, and that's the degree of impairment attributed to a given mine site tends to decrease as the distance from the site increases. So in this oversimplified and hypothetical example, this Headwaters area near the peaks of the mountains has a number of historic mining features, and then as you move down toward the valley bottom, there are fewer mining features. And so the degree of impairment tends to go from very impaired to moderately and then slightly or less impaired. And in a watershed like the Uncompahgre, you have an entire web or system of these impairment impacts and tributaries that may add pollutants or dilute the main stem. So studying the effects of an individual mine site and the downstream waters is, more complex than the first blush. An effective remediation project should create benefits both at the site and the watershed scale. So in short, we reclaim the headwaters to increase the resiliency and improve watershed health at the bottom of the watershed near the valley bottoms. So work near the peaks should benefit the valleys. And I'd really like to point out that these principles are likely to become more important as aridification continues throughout the West. Our snowpacks are not accumulating at the same rates, they're melting more quickly, summer precipitation patterns are changing, and all of this influences the geochemistry. There's some really interesting emerging evidence out of the Roaring Fork Valley that indicates that a changing climate and large, sudden rainstorms, the more extreme climate and precipitation events we're beginning to see are actually creating outsized impacts in areas with historic abandoned mine sites. So to return to our strategy to address historic abandoned mines in the Uncompahgre watershed, I want to be really clear. My second take home tonight is that it takes a village to accomplish this work. Frequently, projects take near a decade to plan. There are many parties engaged in project development, whether it's a scientist collecting data in the field, and a bureaucrat at an agency identifying the liability concerns and authorizing the project, engineers and project managers who design the work, nonprofits that may help secure grant funding, private landowners or mining companies who allow access to their properties or provide funding and support. Just a number of people are required to make this happen. Elected officials at all levels of government are also a critical piece of the puzzle. So for the remainder of this evening's presentation, I'll describe 4 projects in the Canyon Creek watershed. So the Canyon Creek watershed, as I'll be discussing it tonight, will be talking about a really small, unnamed tributary I'll be referring to as Governor Basin, which flows down into Snuffles Creek. Snuffles Creek in turn meets Imogene Creek to form Canyon Creek near the Campbird Mine, and then they both, of course, flow into the Uncompahgre here in Ouray. So following the complete implementation of these mine remediation projects, we hope to generate meaningful water quality and riparian health benefits. The projects I'll be discussing tonight are the Atlas Mill Bank Stabilization Project, the Atlas Mill Tailings Restoration, and the Campbird Project, and then a future project up in Governor Basin. So this photo here shows some heavy equipment working in Snuffles Creek during the bank stabilization project. I'm pretty sure Jeff Literal was on site for this project. He's in the back row. Feel free to ask him some follow-up questions later. So this view shows the Atlas Mill on the right-hand side of the photo, and of course the Snuffles Creek and its floodplain and valley bottom. So Snuffles Creek is on the middle left of the photo and flows up toward the top. In the background of the site, you have the Revenue Mine. So the initial project was completed just off screen to keep Snuffles Creek in a single thread channel, which was critical to preventing additional erosion and migration of these tailings that we see, the yellow tailings more in the foreground and the gray tailings further in the background. So in 2016, UWP completed a bank stabilization project where about 450 feet of stream bank were stabilized on the lower left corner of the photo. As I said earlier, it prevented flooding into the tailings. Shortly after the bank stabilization project was completed, the owners of the revenue mine reached a settlement agreement with the state of Colorado. The settlement required the payment of a penalty, and the penalty funds were matched with additional funds to complete a tailings stabilization project, which reduces the hazard and water quality impacts attributed to the gray and yellow tailings. As of last fall, this remediated area looked excellent. It had a desirable mix of grasses and forbs. There were minimal signs of erosion, and to date, this project has been a success, and I'm personally hopeful that additional benefits may accrue as the site continues to stabilize. The next project is the Campbird Remediation Project, which this is actually an interesting project in the sense that we have a confluence of creeks, which makes the engineering and design quite challenging. And then we also have a confluence of legal responsibility. A portion of the site was mined prior to modern reclamation law, and another portion was mined after. So some of the waste is what's called pre-law, and the other is modern waste. And so EPA remediated the historic tailings on site and then required a cleanup of the modern tailings. So a unique way to navigate the liability challenges around this work. And coming soon, after nearly a decade of site characterization, planning, grant funding, project development, many conversations before a number of stakeholders, is the Governor Basin Restoration Project. And we are thrilled with the remarkable degree of persistence from a number of partners, not just EPA. That was an oversight on my part in the text of the slide. But we, again, are trying to make the foreground of the photo look more like the background of the photo. Here in the middle, low-lying area, the upland, the upgradient portion supports a small wetland. We're hoping to expand that down gradient and into the channel of Governor Creek, which is sitting just above the Jeep in this photo. The large waste rock piles will be regraded and diversion channels will be installed around them to try and isolate the waste from water on site. So again, we'll be doing this by, I think, really leveraging what's on site to manage the costs of this project. There's neutralizing inert waste rock on the upper piles, circled in blue. That'll be the primary cover material for the areas circled in green. And like I said, we'll have perimeter drainages and drainages to convey the terrible number 3 added drainage. And collectively, we think this will, along with soil amendments, allow us to seed selected areas with upland and wetland species. And again, we're trying to minimize the interaction of the environment and the waste. And we're looking to create benefits in downstream reaches, Governor Creek, Snapples Creek, and Canyon Creek. So, I moved through that a little more quickly than I expected, but I'd like to thank you again for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Ashley.
Someone will be passing a mic.
Yeah. Well, first of all, a round of applause for Ashley, if you could. And I'm sure there's probably some questions from the audience, so for those of you who don't have a good loud speaking voice, I can pass you the mic or we'll just repeat the question from up front. So did I see an initial show of hands? Yes.
What was done with the contaminated tails?
At the Atlas Mill site, they were treated in situ, so they were scraped away from the floodplain, capped and covered to isolate them. The project design process included an evaluation to dispose of them elsewhere, but that was far too expensive.
I think you referred to the revenue mine having some financial responsibility for the Atlas project. Why would that be?
So the revenue mine was previously owned by, I believe it was Star Mining. Thank you, Jeff. I see some nodding back there. And the operator, Star, violated the terms of their discharge permit, which resulted in the fine. And Ouray Silver Mines owned the revenue mine by the time the settlement was reached, so it wasn't actually their fault. But they did do something really cool, which was take the penalty funds, which would have otherwise gone into the state's general fund, and dedicate them into what's called a supplemental environmental project, and that's what became the Atlas Tailings stabilization project. So it wasn't that they were responsible for that, it was that they took some initiative and essentially put a penalty to good use. So it was a really cool project.
You mentioned a couple terms. One was stabilization and the other was neutralization, and I don't really know how that works.
Okay, my apologies. Thanks for asking that. So the idea of stabilization is to keep in place and not allow the media in question to move. Neutralization is to try and reduce the acidity of a given mine waste.
But how did you stabilize those things and how did you neutralize?
Okay, so stabilization would occur with a large piece of heavy equipment where they're reducing the slopes and grading the waste to a less, a more stable configuration. So generally flatter, thinner. And then neutralization occurs through chemistry, where we're putting a neutralizing material, so that means something that consumes acid, over the top of something acidic, and the idea is to prevent the migration of acidic materials.
What is the neutralization chemical?
So in this case, it's calcium carbonates from the volcanic tuft.
Are any of the sites in Ouray County designated as Superfund sites under CERCLA?
The Camford site was completed under what's called an emergency removal action, which is a part of the Superfund program, but it's not on what's called the NPL list, so the answer is kind of.
Ashley, are there any tensions between what your organization does and any historical preservation activists as you're trying to remediate these sites, and if so, how do you navigate those?
That's a really great question, and I'm glad you brought it up because I considered including a slide. I personally have not been involved in a project where that was an issue, but I will speak to a past project that UWP did at the Michael Breen mine site, where the, Jeff, help me out on the vocabulary for that structure.
The loadout.
The loadout structure near the tunnel, so the draining adit had a loadout structure. There was some minimal stabilization work done to the loadout structure as the adit drainage was routed around it. So the project did include some historic preservation in work on the structure itself, but more importantly, it kept water away from the structure, which would probably do more to preserve its life than any materials that might have been added to stabilize it.
When you are at the final phase of the project and you're getting
It depends on the budget of the project, but for Governor Basin, we're in a really great position where our grant funds essentially get to be the icing on the cake. So we'll actually be out in the basin this fall collecting native seed from the adjacent undisturbed areas, sending it to a special nursery where they'll grow different sod plugs and wetland mats for us to try to install on site.
I'll get back to you in a sec.
So when the project is done, say at the Atlas Mill, and you've removed the rock from above and put it over to stabilize over the lower area, is it going to look similar when you're done to what we see today on Red Mountain from the Idorado?
No. So the work that will occur is in Governor Basin, and our design is a little more natural than the work completed on the Idorado site. So while it will not look fully natural, the topography and cover will be trying to mimic the natural slopes that would have been there prior to mining. But in some areas, the existing slopes are exceedingly steep and it's difficult and unsafe to operate. So that will actually be designed during construction. So it's a little difficult to speak to the final grades before the project's underway. I think this guy back here had a good question.
So the Camford Mill site, there's all those logs that are on top of the tailings. Is there plastic underneath, or what are they holding down? What's the story?
Yeah, so it's another adage we often say, effective remediation often looks ugly. What those logs are doing is breaking up the slope and creating microhabitat to collect water and promote seed germination. It also helps kind of keep traffic off of sites like that. Not a particular concern there, but on other sites it's a really effective tactic to keep people out of restored areas.
When are you going to start work at the Governor Basin? And how long do you think it's going to be going on?
Ideally, if the stars align on this project, we will be under construction in July of 2024. And again, if things proceed at our ideal pace, we expect construction to take approximately 12 weeks. There will be impacts to that portion of the road in Governor Basin and then lower parts of Camford Road. And we're, throughout this project design process, we've tried to communicate with the county and other local stakeholders who would be affected by those temporary closures.
Up at the Guston area, there's a lot of concrete channels which drain somewhere. I'm not sure where they're taking that acid mine drainage down toward the Idorado Pond, I suppose. What do you envision up at Governor? Are those going to be concrete channels, and where are they going to flow, and how are you going to mitigate any contamination out there?
We will not be using concrete channels up in Governor Basin. We'll be using that neutralizing cap rock that I was talking about to line the channels, and our primary strategies will be what's called run-on control to convey water around contaminated materials to prevent its contamination. Water quality data that we have for the site shows that up gradient of the site, the water is minimally contaminated and metal concentrations are rather low. So if we can direct water around the site, we can prevent a good deal of contamination. And then for drainage within the site, there will be a handful of drainage channels that will likely be directed into a small low spot to allow for retention and infiltration and potentially some passive treatment in that area.
So the water coming out of the Terrible 3, are you going to plug that mine, or is that particularly low in acid?
No, the mine will not be plugged. We don't have excellent data on how frequently the Terrible drains. We know it drains seasonally, but not continuously. and the drainage is acidic and very high in metals. When Ouray Silver Mines was a partner on that project, they anticipated that their mining operations would actually intercept the portion of the mine workings that caused that drainage. So one really wonderful part of having them as a partner was that eventually their operations would have stolen that water and it would have arrived at their treatment facility for treatment. So it would have been incredibly neat, but because they're not operating at this time, we don't, that's no longer a part of the project plan.
Other questions?
Hi everyone, I'm Tanya Ishikawa and I'm the Executive Director of the Uncompahgre Watershed Partnership, and I'm fortunate to work with Ashley. We brought our watershed guides. These we created a few years ago, and they help show you where these projects took place, and they answer a lot of questions about our watershed. So feel free to come up and pick them up here, or they're outside on the table in the lobby as well. And it's our 10th anniversary, as she said. Our nonprofit status came in 2013. We're actually older than that since we were established in 2007. So we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We're really excited about that. And we're doing a big strategic planning and stakeholder engagement. I should have brought our survey link on a QR code or something for you. I did not, but on this one there's our website address. It's also a really easy address, uncompahgrewatershed.org. And you can keep up with what we're doing. We're actually in September, we haven't scheduled them yet, but we're going to do 2 or 3 field trips if we can with the public, similar to what we do at the San Juan Mining and Reclamation Conference that we organize every year. And these tours will take you, not to Governor Basin, that's a little bit high up for us to take you and difficult to get to, but probably to Atlas Mill, we'll probably be going there, and I hope as well up to Ironton in that area, to show you some potential projects as well as some projects we finished. So that's another opportunity to get out and see these things. And then in October, we're going to have a couple stakeholder meetings, one hopefully in Ouray and one in Ridgeway. And you can look at our strategic plan and tell us if you think we're hitting it right for what we're planning to do for the next 5 years or so to try and improve water quality and reach our other goals in the watershed.
Thank you, Tanya. And unless there's any further questions, another round of applause for Ashley. Thank you all for coming.